with facilities in Hudson, Massachusetts and Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. He's worked with clients from youth sports to professional Olympic ranks, but is best known for his extensive work with baseball players. More than 100 professional players train with him each offseason. He also serves as the Director of Player Health and Performance for the New York Yankees in a new role. He's authored over 100 articles, those of which that are research-based have been published in the Journals of Strength and Conditioning. He's published 6 books, co-created 7 video resources, and has presented and sold in over 60 countries all over the world. He's lectured in 5 countries and 25 U.S. states. He also publishes a free blog and newsletter on his website, which, if those of you that don't know, is ericcressey.com, and has a podcast called the Elite Baseball Podcast. Eric is here today with us with Mike Schuk, who's in his first season as the Director of Sports Medicine and Rehabilitation after spending 6 seasons as the team physical therapist and assistant athletic trainer from 2014 to 19. Before joining the Yankees, he worked with the Thor 3, and I hope I'm pronouncing that appropriately, initiative from 2012 to 2014, a program designed to aid physical and mental abilities of Army Special Forces. Prior to his work in the Army, he served as an athletic trainer in the Cleveland Indians minor league system in 2006 and again in 2010. He graduated from the University of Central Florida in 2005 and earned a Doctor of Physical Therapy degree in Nova Southeastern from Fort Lauderdale, Florida in 2010. And lastly, Tim Lentych is the current head athletic trainer for the New York Yankees, serving in his 17th season with the organization. He spent the last 4 seasons, 16 to 19, as the Yankees assistant athletic trainer, after serving as the club's minor league head athletic trainer from 2012 to 2015. He began his Yankees career in 2004 as the trainer for the short season single A Staten Island team before holding the same role with the single A Charleston from 2005 to 2007. 2008 to 2011, he was the head athletic trainer for the Double A Trenton team, where he earned the Eastern League Athletic Trainer of the Year award in 2009. He earned his bachelor's degree in applied sciences and technology with a concentration in athletic training from Ball State University, Go Maction, in 2001. Worked with an athletic training intern, as an athletic training intern with the Baltimore Orioles that same year. He earned his master's degree from the University of Tennessee in 2004 and currently resides in Tampa, Florida with his wife. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Eric and his boys.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is my first go around with a WebEx meeting, so I'm going to be doing my best to kind of overcome some new technology. By all means, please fire away in the chat section or raise your hand if I can see you on screen to let me know if you can or can't hear me. Austin Ardrey, you're the guy I can see in my view, so give me a thumbs up if I have good audio. Good man. All right. Thank you very much.
Good.
Oh my God. So we're going to rock and roll with this. The way it's structured is I'll be joined by Tim Lentych, our head athletic trainer, as you know, and Mike Schuk, our director of sports medicine. Those guys are going to chime in and really do some more of a Q&A format. But I think it's important maybe to just kind of set the stage a little bit with some of our overarching principles that we really try to rely on as we tack things, both in our work with the Yankees and also what I do at our private sector facility. As a brief background on this presentation, so I signed my contract with the Yankees in December. Both Tim and Mike have been with the organization in previous years, and they've moved into new roles. One of the things that we kind of agreed upon was that we need to have a common language that everybody spoke across departments to make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction. So this was actually the first little bit of an organization-wide basically seminar that we did in early February prior to the start of spring training, just to try to get everybody in the same room and head in the right direction. So I'll give you some insights kind of on how we've attacked things. It's certainly a new collaboration across multiple disciplines and maybe more expansive collaboration that was there in the past, but we've got a lot of really good people rowing in the same direction. So this might be an Eric Cressey presentation, but in a lot of ways it's representative of a lot of people that are doing much bigger things than I possibly could on my own. The thing I want to emphasize to you is one of the things that we're working on is taking a lot of the principles that Cressey Sports Performance has put into action in the private sector with a much smaller staff and a fewer head count per day, and we're looking to roll it out to a major league organization on a much bigger scale. What a lot of people on the outside of baseball may not understand, and something that I truly didn't understand until I actually got involved in baseball, is just the sheer volume of people at a major league and minor league spring training complex. So I believe in our organization we had about 385 players at the start of spring training. There were 90 at our Dominican Academy. We had about 63 in major league camp, and then the rest were all spread over minor league camp. And obviously you have a ton of different support staff across multiple departments. So the sheer number of bodies involved in this whole process is something that maybe folks on the outside don't necessarily appreciate. So it was eye-opening for me, and it started to make us think about, what are the principles that guide our decisions, how we coach, how we teach our coaches to coach. So that's what we're going to work through today, and hopefully lead to a good discussion after the fact. For us, there are several components to synergy, right? You obviously have the coaching staff. We have skill development folks, so that might be Tanner Swanson, our catching coordinator. It might be Sam Breen, our director of pitching. It might be Matt Blake, who's our major league pitching coach, who kind of wears multiple hats with the coaching staff, the skill development crew, the analytics. So we have a strong analytics department that helps us out, on everything imaginable, from, looking at advanced scouting reports on how to attack hitters. They may also look really, really closely at pitch grips on high-speed cameras. There's a lot of different things that these folks do behind the scenes. Obviously, we have medical staff, two great members of our medical staff on this call, strength and conditioning crew, which I kind of head up, and we Brett McCabe and Matt Rutledge is our major league head guy, and then our assistant. And obviously, we have minor league coordinator and several minor league coaches underneath that. We also have a performance science department, which is headed up by David Whiteside. David's outstanding. So, a lot of people would call that sports science. We approach it maybe a little bit differently, just because it's so heavily linked with our skill development crew and our analytics department, particularly as we do some facility expansions and get a little bit more involved in that regard. We also have nutrition. Drew Weisberg's our major league dietitian as well, so Drew kind of takes the lead on that. And obviously we have a strong mental skills department, which is becoming more and more prevalent. The thing that we really wanted to make sure was that in our sports medicine realm, all these different people were communicating regularly. And after we gave this presentation, I can't tell you how many people came up to me and just said, it's awesome for us to all get in the room and have these conversations. So I think that's the single most important thing that you can have in any sports medicine initiative, is communication across all of these departments. I know a lot of folks on this call are in the college setting, and there may be scenarios where the analytics guy is an intern that was a graduate program who eventually wants to get into baseball operations. Oftentimes your coaching staff is also your skill development guy. Your third assistant may be the guy who takes care of the field. Like, there's a lot more people wearing multiple hats. Obviously, in an organization like the Yankees, we can compartmentalize a lot more. So just appreciate that it actually may be easier at the collegiate level, where you have fewer people involved. If it's a staff of 6 or 7 as opposed to 60 or 70, sometimes it's easier to get everybody doing the right thing. The other thing that we really worked on this and I think it's an important consideration, is I'm a firm believer, and I think everybody else that you talk to, who are in these departments will tell you that you can't separate scouting from player development. And historically in baseball, those two things were completely separate. In fact, you'd have a lot of player development folks who would get irritated if a scout commented on how to develop a player. You'd have scouting people who would say, player development, folks stay in the lane. We communicate all the time with our scouting department. Mike and Tim and I are all intimately involved on reviewing, medical records on players that we're considering signing. And also, we have Steve Donahue, who's our, is previously our head athletic trainer. He's still with the organization as director of medical services. Steve reviews, pre-draft, basically medical records on anybody we're considering for the amateur draft. He's been working hard on that. I've had calls with our amateur scouting department on a pretty regular basis, because we want to make sure that they start to speak these languages, right? I don't expect to, have our pro scouting director understand what, femoral anterior glide syndrome is, but there are some things that we're looking at in terms of how we create a smooth, consistent, progression from the time people are drafted or signed to how they develop as a player. So these are all intimately linked with a lot of different departments. I think for us, there are some things that were non-negotiable. And actually, when I first got the job, Mike was here visiting his parents in Fort Lauderdale, and he hopped in the car and drove up. And I want to say we spent 3.5 hours talking in my office about a lot of these things that we wanted to iron out. We want to talk about mutual goals, and I think that's something that our organization, in particular our director of baseball operations, Matt Ferry, really heads up, is making sure that there are mutual goals across all departments, that the skill development folks understand what the strength and conditioning folks see, the strength and conditioning folks understand what our sports medicine staff sees. So basically, during spring training, we have organizational meetings that discuss every single player across the board. There's probably 50 people in the room. It's a wide open microphone, so anybody can contribute to discussion. And one of the things that the coronavirus downtime has allowed us to do, we've actually had calls as an organization, probably, I want to say 20 to 25 people on every call every afternoon at 2:30 p.m. And we discuss now how our, basically goals for those individuals have evolved and changed, since we first got there in early February. So it's kind of like a good 2-month check-in on, are they progressing in the right direction? Are they evolving? So that's been actually really, really exciting, seeing how this stuff has unfolded over the course of 2 months with a new staff on multiple fronts, whether that's a new pitching coach. We've got obviously a new modified sports medicine staff, new strength and conditioning coaches. And so everybody's in on those conversations. One of the other goals, particularly under the sports medicine umbrella, is we wanted to speak one language. So as an example, if we look at all of the different philosophies that are out there right now, whether it's, if you look at PRI, you look at DNS, PRI refers to neutrality, right? DNS refers to joint centration. If you look at traditional physical therapy speak, they'll talk about the instantaneous center of rotation. All it is a way of saying a joint is in neutral. But I think for us, we wanted to make sure that those things were clearly related. So, it's important to me that, as an example, if we have an athlete, who's got downwardly rotated shoulder blades, and I say he's a scapular downward rotation syndrome guy, our staff understands that. That's a guy that needs to make some specific modifications in the weight room. We need to spend more time, coaching them into scapular upward rotation. We need to be cognizant that they don't misinterpret the cues we give them as they're going through their arm exercises. So, I think those are important things. You have to make sure everybody speaks the same language. Things that we've heard, and everybody's been in these experiences, regardless of your role, you hear stay in your lane, right? You hear know your role. You hear that's not my problem for people that think they don't need to work outside their realm. I can tell you, we had a call 2 days ago, just basically a second opinion on one of our players, and really all three of our athletic trainers, Tim, Marc, as well as Alfonso, our other athletic trainer, were on that call. I FaceTimed in. We had the athlete in question. We had Dr. Ahmad, our doctor, as well as Dr. Murphy, who's our ortho down in Tampa as well. So one of the things that I think we do a really, really good job of is, everybody gets in the same room and speaks the same language. But there's nobody saying, this is your lane, this is my lane, don't overstep your bounds. Like if one of us wants to ask a question of Dr. Ahmad, he's fantastic. He'll actually solicit our opinions. I think that's something that we really try to create, is a scenario where you break down those walls so everybody can speak on a level. And then, we joke, no apathy and no a-holes, right? You don't want people that don't care. I think it's the Steve Jobs quote, it's better to have a hole than an asshole. So just keep that in mind as you're working through some of this stuff, is if you get one bad apple in the mix, they can make these things really, really problematic. And we've been fortunate to have 2 really good months of momentum as we started this up, and even more if you look further beyond that. Let's see if I can get this to go. So crucial competencies for me, anatomy is a huge thing. That's the underpinning of pretty much every sports medicine dynamic. You have to understand, not just how the body is structured, but how it dictates, the function that follows. If you understand what good movement looks like, you can actually start to appreciate aberrant movement. So, we want to make sure there's communication across departments on that front, and the players. I think that's a key competence that this organization has done a really, really good job of, is making sure that there are, better and better direct communications to the players. I think that's traditionally been one of the biggest challenges in professional baseball, is that there are so many people that a lot of players don't understand where they stand. So that's something that I think a lot of really good people in our organization have been fighting to improve. We've also understood, we're coming into a, obviously arguably the largest sports market in the world, right? We certainly have a lot of athletes that have a lot of competing demands for their attention. A lot of them are very well compensated. And, that goes, with the territory. But, I think one of the things you realize is there's a lot of people that are competing for their attention. So in that regard, when I came in as the new guy, I certainly had a reputation from the private sector and a lot of folks who had interacted with me either directly or indirectly in that regard. But we wanted to make sure we got to know players before we demanded that they follow our programs. So we spent a lot of time early on the relationship building, doing outreach in the winter time, just getting to know guys, checking in, getting to know their strength and conditioning coaches in the off season. So you have to know, they have to know and like you before they're going to trust you. So that's been something that I think we've done a really, really good job on. And to be honest, we were shocked at how good the buy-in was with a lot of our players as we went through this. So. And last but not least, I think if you educate your staff, you get everybody speaking the same language, it makes it that much easier to have an individualized roadmap for every player. We all agreed, going into this, that there isn't just going to be one dry erase board with a program on it for everybody. So if you walk into our weight room during spring training, you're literally going to find programs for every single player. If you look at what Timmy and what Mike do on a daily basis, we get our injury report at the end of the day. They meticulously describe every single treatment that players get, whether it's proactive or reactive. So there's documentation. But on top of that, it's not just this guy got a massage. He got trigger point work on his lat, and we basically use cupping on his rhomboids and this, that, and the other. So it's actually vividly detailed so that we can actually get a good individualized plan in place for everybody, and that everybody in the mix understands it as well. So there's a heavy documentation component, but it does pay off. So we talked a lot about our assessment early on. Certainly there's a strength and conditioning component, kind of your classic movement screens, things along those lines, maybe more of those general components. You look at a push-up, you look at an overhead lunge walk, you look at a toe touch, and you can pull a lot of information from those. And certainly there's more specific assessments as well that goes in conjunction with that. You have classic orthopedic range of motion tests. You have manual muscle tests where we actually will quantify that. Using basically dynamometers and things to those ends. I think one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is where people are in spring training, because in many cases those are used to justify return to play. Are you back to your baseline? Certainly in this dynamic, there may be scenarios where an agent wants to know, like, what criteria does this player have to meet before he's allowed to be returned to play. So I think we tend to err on the side of doing too many assessments, just because you want to make sure you have as much information as possible. And that's something that we've kind of streamlined. Moving forward, there will be a more significant performance science component. We're certainly doing a fair amount of that with our minor league side. On the big league side, I think we were sensitive to not having too many asks, where a lot of big leaguers come in and they're focused on baseball and asking them to all get on the force plates and all do NordBord tests and things along those lines. You just have to be careful with your asks. Whereas at the minor league side and, even working in the college setting, you can tend to be a little bit more bold with that, whether it's to actually predict stuff with that athlete, to learn about them, or to, maybe even roll it out and do some research. So that's something that, we'll be doing a lot more of moving forward. But in the short term, we tend to be a very heavy movement oriented assessment, because it tends to drive our programming a little bit more. You always want to prioritize low-hanging fruit. I always say that when you do an assessment, do all your paperwork, et cetera, and then go back, and you should be able to circle 2 or 3 big things that jump out at you. And for those of you who are familiar with the selective functional movement assessment, I think one of the really key things that, that Gray and Lee and their crew outlined there is the concept of chasing dysfunctional, non-painful patterns, right? So if you see a thoracic spine that's very stuck, very rarely is it painful, right? You can chase thoracic spine mobility, and sometimes you're going to get shoulder and turn rotation, right? You're going to get, some downstream benefits. Maybe the neck pain goes away. You want to be careful about chasing a lot of, dysfunctional, painful patterns, because you may be plowing into pathology. So when in doubt, look for patterns that don't move well, that are asymptomatic, and a lot of times you can get some really good benefits there. So a lot of my circles, from an assessment standpoint, prioritize, that low-hanging fruit. We want to obviously differentiate medical and movement diagnoses. It shouldn't come as any surprise to anybody who works in baseball that you will see some very ugly MRIs. So, for us, we want to make sure that, we're not just living by that MRI. That's the medical diagnosis, but we also want a movement diagnosis. And what you realize is that you can get the same medical diagnosis, right? You could have a chronic biceps tendinopathy in a throwing shoulder because of, basically a scapular downward rotation syndrome. You could get it from a humeral anterior glide syndrome. You can get it because someone's got a, super loose anterior capsule. That's a compensatory response. So different movement diagnoses can create different medical diagnoses and vice versa. So you just have to be cognizant of what's going on in front of you. And I think for us, I'm a strength and conditioning coach. I don't think we have any MDs on the call. We're precluded from making diagnoses on the medical side, but there's nothing wrong with making a movement diagnosis where you say, this is what I see in front of you, these are the patterns that I think I need to adjust. Much of our stuff is proximal to distal, work on the spine, work on the core, take care of the neck, and you will often see some pretty substantial downstream benefits. Obviously integrate with your sport specific screens as well. I think this is something that we've really worked hard to do. Matt Blake, our Major League pitching coach, is excellent in this regard. I've had an opportunity to work with Matt for, almost a decade now. And I think the thing that he does incredibly well is he takes a lot of these movement screens, starts to appreciate what they really mean in the context of the delivery, right? Individual who can't effectively get into his front hip may lose extension. So there's just a lot of different places you can look at that. So I think it's important to have that communication between your skill coaches and your sports medicine staff. And then last but not least, we do a lot of test-retest, right? Imagine someone who's got an ulnar neuritis presentation. The last thing you want to do is go right to the elbow, right? You have to clear the neck. You've got to clear basically the first rib and clavicle. You've got to look at the coracoid process. You got to look at the anterior aspect of the humerus. You've got to look at medial triceps. There's so many things that can, basically block that nerve down, to be problematic before it actually gets to the elbow. So test-retest is a really big thing. And I think it's particularly prevalent as we've had a much stronger manual therapy component. Just to give you a little bit of insights on our staff, both of our Major League strength coaches are also licensed massage therapists. Everybody on our sports medicine staff has a strong manual background. Then we have massage therapists. We have an acupuncturist who's with us. So there's a team chiropractor. So we have basically these amenities at our fingertips. So that's something that we believe in heavily, particularly on a 162 game season when you've got to roll guys out there on a very, very frequent basis. All right, so as we kind of wrap up, I just want to throw a few different things at you, and I think we have a lot of people who are in the baseball world, and basically this might be kind of a good refresher on some of the most important things to think about, and maybe it leads to some good conversation as we go to the Q&A. But these are kind of your big five. If you understand these positions from a throwing standpoint, you're going to be in a good spot, right? So we have layback, right? So certainly max external rotation. We have two different things happening, right? We've got your classic internal impingement potential at the shoulder, as the arm lays back. The humerus obviously externally rotates, but we also realize via the peel back mechanism, we've got a twisting and tugging, and if there's superior migration of the humeral head or the scapula doesn't upwardly rotate enough, we tend to hang out on that biceps tendon, right? So that can be something that creates actual problems with the biceps tendon itself. It may create a superior labral pathology of fraying, or the biceps tendon may actually pull off. Certainly we get the development of Bennett's lesions. We see undersurface rotator cuff problems. There's a lot of different things that can happen to the shoulder in this position. I think certainly we have to, take a look at what's happened at the elbow. There's some research from Dr. Fleisig's group, I believe it was, a long time ago, that talked about this being the equivalent of a 40-pound weight pulling down the hand. So we've got a ton of medial elbow stress taking place, and so that's in an advanced population like this. We're obviously going to see a lot of medial tensile stresses, UCL injuries, flexor strains, ulnar neuropathy, or things along those lines. But I think the other thing that's really important to consider is in this position, you can also get lateral compressive issues. So you get some banging on the outside of the joint where potentially you wind up with like a little league elbow in a younger population. We've certainly seen scenarios where athletes have wound up with bony issues on the lateral aspect of the joint. So important to really control this position from a number of different standpoints. The other thing too is just take a look at the thoracic hyperextension in place here. I think there is an assumption that everybody's very kyphotic. That's not the case with absolutely everybody. He's actually a little bit more bowed through his thoracic spine. So not everybody needs to be aggressively moved in a thoracic extension and rotation. They may already have plenty, and you may need to work at the other end of the equation to actually take care of them from thoracic flexion. The last thing I would also say is just take note. It's hard to see from this particular image, but the neck gets beaten up pretty bad in these positions, particularly if you have an athlete who's got an aggressive head whip or anything like that. we're seeing more and more thoracic outlet in baseball as guys are throwing harder and harder. So just be cognizant of what's taking place at the neck, and you'll realize that, there's potentially a lot of different places where people can have problems. Ball release. I threw a couple different ones at you. This is actually Brad Hand, the closer for the Indians. If you guys watch Brad pitch, it almost looks like an apathetic delivery. It's very closed off, and extension for him is not a big thing. Throwing downhill is. He's got one of the best sliders in baseball. But Brad does not have a lot of extension, whereas Josh James, Astros, tends to get down the mound substantially more. Josh is the guy who's got a pretty crazy movement with his changeup, does some funky things there, and obviously has a ball that moves all over the place. So there's many different ways to be successful. We know that we've got some pretty extensive distraction forces on the humerus here. Your biceps tendon gets beaten up a little bit as a compressive stabilizer of the joint. One of the things that's actually probably overlooked as we get to these positions, the humerus actually doesn't internally rotate that far past neutral. I believe Dr. Andrews talked about it at ASMI this year, where it was in many cases the humerus doesn't even get to 0 degrees. So I think this is where some of the glenohumeral internal rotation stuff has been overdone. You actually don't need a crazy amount of shoulder internal rotation to throw at a baseball at a higher level. I think a lot more of the injuries that we're seeing are because guys acquire so much passive external rotation and don't control that, which relates back to that previous slide of, having uncontrolled external rotation. So certainly in this position, you're going to have really strong cuffs. You're going to have a scapula that upwardly rotates, particularly in the bottom position, as Josh demonstrates. You need to have a thoracic spine that can flex to deliver that scapula. And we'll talk about this in the lower extremity in a few slides, but a lot of moving parts to allow this to happen effectively. And you have to remember, if there's a scenario where you can rob Peter to pay Paul, right? So in many cases, you'll see, aggressive elbow extension in people who don't do things well further up. So, we forget your UCL doesn't just get banged up during the layback phase with valgus stress, but it also is a weak resistor to elbow hyperextension at the elbow. So just be careful about guys that overcook sliders and try to get around the baseball. They can have problems out in front. Certainly hip-shoulder separation is a consideration as well. You have a guy, Noah, as a double-A pitcher for the Rangers, tend to be more closed off here. So for him, obviously, there's a lot more thoracic rotation that's going to be needed subsequently for him to throw a glove side fastball. Josh is a little bit more online. You see Luzardo again, more online. This is a guy who's throwing consistently 97 to 99 at about 5'11", 6 feet. So when you look at these, the thing you have to appreciate, and it's hard to see in the all-black uniform, but you can notice that the pelvis has started to rotate towards the plate, right? So we have counterclockwise rotation of the pelvis while the torso is still rotating clockwise. So effectively, you have this hip-shoulder separation that's creating whip. What we realize is that attachment of the 12th rib is where we see most oblique strains, right? So if we don't get that motion in the right place and we don't have the right amount of rotary stability through the core, and we're not able to resist that extension through here, we can create a scenario where someone would have a front-sided oblique injury, right? And certainly, getting the ball release, if we go back to this previous slide, we have athletes where they need a lot of what we would call right apical expansion, the ability to effectively separate their rib cage, from their pelvis. So, if you have a really dense, fibrotic, nasty quadratus lumborum, this is a hard position to get to throw a glove side fastball. So, a lot of stuff that has to work to deliver the baseball. I think this is a very important consideration from a lower extremity standpoint. Ruben's a guy who's kind of your classic big ride on his fastball. He has decent spin rate, but more than anything, he has a ton of extension, so he gets really far down the mound. This is superhuman passive hip extension. So what we realize is nobody has that much hip extension, short of probably elite ballerinas and things like that. What's happening in just about every individual in baseball is they're sacrificing the passive restraints in the front of their hip in order to get here, right? Jacob deGrom is a guy who gets way down the mound. So you'll often see anterior hip irritation. One of the things that we can look at is how do we get good glute max control to basically center the femoral head in the socket and prevent that anterior gliding. Just like the rotator cuff protects the arthrokinematics of the shoulder joint, the glutes tend to protect the arthrokinematics of the hip joint when we get really hamstrings and adductor dominant into that hip extension. And then last but not least, this is Mike Soroka from the Braves. Soroka's another guy who's not a big extension guy. He's a great turbo sinker and, big slider guy. But when you look at this position, that front hip pullback, right, what we're effectively trying to do with that is we're trying to take the rotational stress from the delivery and shift it into a linear pattern of, to deliver the baseball, right? So effectively, he's pulling into that hip. A lot of people get very, very caught up in just doing knee extension. They call it lead leg blocking. For me, it's much more about front hip pullback. That rotation into that front side, he has to accept force in all three planes of motion. So we kind of use the analogy, it's kind of like riding a bike into a curb, but our training should reflect that. You should be able to basically accept that force in your front hip in order to throw a baseball downhill. When you actually put it all together, see if I can actually play this video. It's not looking good for it. Sorry about that. But, this was going to be a video of Scherzer, just kind of demonstrate it in slow motion. But unfortunately, it's not going to work for me. I'll put it up online for you guys afterwards. But I do want to make sure that you guys realize that this is not just a discussion of throwing. Many of these positions take place in the hitting delivery. It's just a little bit less hip-shoulder separation, right, because they're responding to pitch. That's front hip pullback, right? That's the thoracic flexion and scapular movement that you need to get to ball release position, right? There's less hip extension, obviously, in the hitting delivery, but you still need to have a well-controlled hip joint. So I think a lot of people, look at baseball and they think, this is just something that's an upper extremity problem, but I don't want to speak for it, but I want to say I did a presentation just recently that said there was about $130 million wasted on lower extremity and core issues in Major League Baseball just last year. So we can take a lot of these same movement principles and apply them to pitchers and position players alike. To be honest, my programs tend to be much more, basically loose and tight, left and right-handed than they tend to be pitcher versus position player. Because I believe that good movement is good movement. We should always fall back on that. So that said, beyond just some of the stuff we're going to do, I know Jason's sending out basically the handouts for all this stuff, but there are 2 free presentations, Individualizing the Management over at Throwing Athletes. I actually did that at ABCA just a few years ago. It just speaks to some of the unique approaches to managing rotational sport athletes. And then this is actually one you can actually see that video of Scherzer. I talked about it a little bit, but hip-shoulder separation and rotational athletes, understanding a little bit more about the thoracic spine. Those are both free on my website if you guys are interested. And with that said, I'm happy to take some questions.
He had a link of for discounts on some of his courses.
Does it?
Performance therapy course. Came open.
Got it.
You guys did.
And all that should put it on there.
Yes.
Don't be bashful, ladies and gents. Fire away. Thank you. That's the material.
Fortunately, that we have. That's what we want to go with.
Yeah, he told me next day.
Eric, I'll ask a question.
All right, so we got a question. Can you guys hear me still? Give me a thumbs up if you can.
Yep.
All right. Do you guys SFMA, FMS as your common language? We certainly use them a lot. We'll use them with our active straight leg raise, 1, 2, and 3, and certainly cervical screens, flexion, extension, cervical rotations. We will use DN, DP, etc. I think they always tend to come with a follow-up to speak to anything like that. Give the next one to Timmy and Mike. Timmy's ready. I can see him. He's leaning in. Especially because I can't hear any of you.
I got one for Eric. Obviously, we know on our end, but for them, based on shoulder program, shoulder exercises, warm-up exercises for the shoulder via weight room and or the training room, what's the best strategy to work on that based on a same lingo and understanding between the two departments?
Just so you guys are aware, I don't think Eric is getting audio for whatever reason, so you may need to chime questions in via text.
I think I just got my audio back.
How about now?
I got it.
There we go. Perfect.
I don't know what happened. I think when I shut the power off, it worked.
Sure.
All right, so we got some questions rolling in. Where are we looking? All right. There's one from M. Holiday. Is there some controversy now related to hip-shoulder separation, different schools of thought? I think it's internet controversy. People saying the different things to describe the same presentation. Basically where the point of contention is do you really need that much? And the answer is no. It needs to be well-timed and controlled. I think we're seeing a lot of athletes that are chasing extreme range of motion they may not be able to control, and that's a bad idea. But I put up an Instagram post of just like Mike Soroka just not too long ago. His hip-shoulder separation is not substantial. It's just enough to make it work. If you look at the research, golfers tend to have a ton. Baseball pitchers tend to have a little bit less, and then hitters have even less than that. The reason is very simple. Golfers dictate the pace of the game. Pitchers have to hold runners. Obviously, hitters have to respond to the baseball that's coming at them. So, there are definitely different schools of thought with respect to hip-shoulder separation, but I think in many cases they're just using different terminology to describe the same thing. Is Mike on here still, Tim? I see you. Where's Shucky?
Yeah, we'll call him back. He's with a player right now.
All right, no worries. All right, Tim, you're taking this. It is. What's the best way to get coaches to buy into changes? My coach has an old school approach.
That's good because we got a lot of new coaches right now, so they're on the understanding. However, you're going to have to put it in like simple terms for them, kind of get into terms that they would relate. We had situations where, they dictate everything, but if you explain it to them in some type of rational detail that they would understand, I think it would come full circle in order for them to understand, and then you guys put it together. If there's a program to follow that you see based on an assessment, if a player gets hurt or you need a change to gain velocity, or you're just trying to work through some things, I think that if you present it, you have backing of the pitching coach and or hitting coach to present it and you guys are all on the same page and present it to the manager or the head coach, I think it'll go a long way to kind of establish that communication level to have him understand it.
I think Tim's one of the best at that too. Whether he recognizes it or not, this is one of the things I recognized about him is he's very clear and concise with his communications to staff members, right? There's not like superfluous communication. He doesn't speak over their heads. He does a really, really good job of relating complex topics to people in terminology they can understand really, really well.
I mean, the other thing to go back on that too, Eric mentioned about communication level and us being in such a big market. That's where if something happens, the pitching coach, manager, general manager have to be on the same page with the athlete or the player, because you don't want them, especially our media relations here. We've got media, through every hole and every nick and cranny here, looking through the fence and trying to find something to write about. But if we're not on the same page and a player says something and the GM and the manager say something, it's going to create a pretty big storm that we're going to have to try to dig ourselves out. You just don't want to do that because you have to manage and take care of the athletes first.
I like it. Let's see. So they're cascading in as, let's see. What would you guys recommend to staffs that maybe aren't able to see each other each day or be in the same facility daily as far as communication, making sure athletes know their parameters, restrictions, modifications? It sounds like, is this in light of the COVID-19 challenges? This is from Scott Stansbury. You out there, Scott?
Yeah, not necessarily that, but more just like in some college settings, obviously athletic trainers might be in a different facility than strength and conditioning, or they might be separated or working with other teams. So
Yeah. I think, to be honest, it comes down to like, if you try to find time, it'll never happen. You have to make time. So for us, it's meetings. Like during spring training, and Tim sends takes the lead on it. Every night we get an email with an Excel file listing every player with injuries, whether it's a guy who is 6 months post-op or anything like that. And there's a 7 a.m. meeting. It's massage therapists, it's strength and conditioning coaches, it's director of medical services, ATCs, physical therapists, nutrition. Everybody's in there on that discussion. Because if you wait to try to do it once all the players roll in, you're in trouble. It has to happen early, and I actually always look forward to those meetings. It's kind of a good way to start the day. There's a lot of ball thing that goes on. We have a good time. So I think that's the secret, is you've got to make time instead of finding time. And I've come to realize that in the private sector as well, even with a smaller staff. Like we bank really, really heavily on, our weekly in-services, just opportunities. Right now with this going on, to give you a backstory, like we have pretty much 2:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. calls every day. Like I said, with a bunch of guys on Zoom. And then on our Tuesday afternoons, I have a call right after that, 3:30 to 4 I do with our Florida staff, and then 4 until whenever for our Massachusetts guys. So I did, 2.5 hours straight on Zoom for that just the other day. It's important, because if you wait for it to be a problem, it's going to be a problem. If you get out ahead of it, you can save yourself a lot of headaches.
Yeah, we even with that, to add on what Eric's saying, that even our facility down here in Tampa, the weight room and the training room is not attached. We're separated, so we're on a group text as well. So if Brett McCabe or Matt Rutledge, like Eric said, they're both massage therapists. If they happen to do a quick, active release or any type of release on a player, they'll text us real quick, so we don't duplicate it, or we're all on the same page. So I think a text strain will be best as well. And then additional to what Eric said, add in at the end of the day, I always like to be ahead of the game. So when we send out the reports, at least Eric and everyone on staff will have it. We send out medical reports to all the GMs, coaching staff, scouts that are on it. So if they have questions in the morning, you're prepared to be ready to go. And the only addition you have to make is to make changes if someone comes in either worse, better, or the same. You make those changes first instead of backtracking from what happened the night before or the day before.
It's so much easier now that technology is what it is. Like, I just think back to when I got started. Like, yeah, you had emails and you could make a phone call, but the quality of like cell phone videos, things like that. Like, I got a text from our strength coach who's still in Tampa with some of our rehab guys, and he sent me some, sprint footage of a guy in the outfield, and it was like, vividly slow motion, all this stuff where you can see everything you want to see. So it's, it's definitely a different world than it used to be. So leverage that, take advantage of it. William asks, is there a point of diminishing returns in terms of shoulder/rotator cuff work? For example, pre and post throw every day along with work in the weight room. Yeah, that can definitely be an issue. It's honestly, it speaks to the communication we were just talking about. Is the last thing we want is for us to crush a guy in a weight room and then send him down the hall, and Tim and Mike and their crew to crush him in the training room too. So what I look at is kind of multiple different ways that you can categorize cuff work. So we have kind of our low-level motor control work, right? Those might be like your pro and external rotation, some of like your FRC work, some of your end range liftoffs, where you're looking to basically better control your end range external rotation and basically work patterning. Those are things that we do during every single warm up. And then you also have exercises that are more about timing. Those are your rhythmic stabilizations, maybe some of your 90-90 holds. And then, you can build on that a little bit more, and you can obviously have like true strength stuff that might range from manual resistance stuff to cable stuff to even like bottoms up carries and Turkish get-ups and things like that. And then obviously you have all your weight training as well. You could train 6 days a week if you structure it correctly, right? So we might do, some low-level motor control stuff on 2 days as like recovery days. We might have 2 days of cuff timing, 2 days of cuff strength that tend to, fit nicely with upper body stuff. So you definitely can overdo it. But I would just tell you, like, remember that every time those guys pick up a baseball and go to throw, that's cuff stuff. Every time they do their little bit of band stuff before they throw as a warm up, like, that's cuff stuff. So I think the mistake that the industry has made has been crushing guys for like 45 to 60-minute sessions twice a week where they bury them. I'm a big believer that you should almost feel refreshed when you leave. Like, just just enough to challenge it. Because you remember your rotator cuff is very reflexive, right? If you go to pick up a suitcase, it's going to fire. So we want to make sure that we're training it accordingly. We don't want to place through a lot of fatigue because you're dealing with a very, you're dealing with a joint that's controlled in a very fine window.
It's good. Yep, I agree with Eric.
Oh.
Just an FYI here, we got about 5 more minutes for Q&A with Eric and the guys because we do need to get Marc going as he has some other obligations.
All right. Let's see. I'll give this one to Timmy. As a collegiate baseball AT, I'm concerned about my athletes returning to sport following this period. What kind of training would you recommend at this point in the year where guys are typically mid-season but are now in a holding pattern?
Yeah, after following up, we kind of divided up our list, position players versus pitchers. So I've been following up a lot of pitchers. We get that same question because some guys want to ramp it up just to make sure they're ready. However, I think based on, what we keep hearing based on the state and MLB, some states are opening up, like down here in Florida, we opened back up based on, Governor DeSantis' ruling that sport is essential. However, we took it an extra step is that the hitters can only hit Monday, Wednesday, Friday because, honestly, the end goal, we don't have anything yet. Once we know, we're going to ramp it up as we see fit. Regarding pitchers, since I talked to them a lot of them are throwing one bullpen a week, and it could be thrown into a screen. It could be thrown into a nettings of some sort, a padding of some sort. Some guys obviously have the ability to buy a Rapsodo and some tools to kind of, engage their effort level. So they're using that to the best of their ability to kind of go at a moderate pace. And then once we see fit, Matt Blake is also contacting them as well to kind of saying, hey, you need to stay right there, or we need to kind of ramp it up depending on how far along we are right now. I mean, we don't know anything. It could be even 3 to 4 more weeks based on what they keep saying. But you got to try to calm them down, hold them down to probably a moderate pace based on the mound and based on hitting wise. But then you got to remember like a recovery days of either a moderate, low, and high intensity days based on weight room and conditioning wise. But you got to have recovery days in there too because we're still at a holding pattern.
I think the biggest mistake people are going to make right now is just shutting down completely from throwing, just because they're going to get surprised when the ramp up call comes for them. So we really stand on guys. I think pretty much everybody we have is if they're not off the mound throwing bullpens, they're definitely throwing aggressively at least a couple times a week. But I do think pretty much everybody's off the mound. And I know we still have some rehab stuff going at our Florida facility. So every guy that I've interacted with has stayed off the mound too. So those are the guys who are going to be caught out in the cold, is the ones that have shut down. Do you see any conflicts between the corrective concepts in PRI and DNS? How do you integrate the different principles? I think you can borrow bits and pieces from all of them. So the better question is, how many commonalities do you see across philosophies, right? Even just looking at manual therapy, right? You've got Graston, you've got ART, you've got cupping, you've got dry needling, you've got different schools of thought with respect to dry needling. I think all of them are tools in your toolbox, and you just need to borrow bits and pieces from everything and put them together. So if you walk into our facility on a daily basis, you'll see PRI, DNS, FRC, SARMAN. You'll see a million different acronyms, and for me, it's much more about making sure that we're creating a philosophy that benefits our athletes.
So as we kind of transition here to get Dr. R rolling, I really want to say thanks to Eric, Tim, and Mike. It's awesome for you guys to take the time to do this. Obviously, I sent out the link to Eric's charity foundation. If you want to throw a little plug for that, Eric, feel free.
Yeah, Tanner Swanson is our major league catching coordinator and quality control coach, and Tanner's based out in Seattle now during this downtime, and he put together a really cool fundraiser basically to raise money for COVID-19 research through a cancer institute out there. So I've been supporting him. We're actually going to do a call tomorrow at 4 o'clock, just another webinar on a different topic. But if you guys have the wherewithal to do so, there's no pressure to do so, but it'd be great if you could support the cause. So wish you all well in this season. Too bad it's not taking place, but we're all sending good vibes your way and appreciate it. I know how hard you guys work. It's not an easy job, and sometimes it's very thankless. But I know you make a difference in the lives of your athletes, and it speaks volumes that you're busting your butt probably on a sunny afternoon wherever you are to get better on a day like this. So thank you for taking the time to spend it with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Much appreciated, guys. Dr. R, if you want to go ahead and try and share your screen. I think, Eric, you might have to drop your sharing. There we go.
That work okay?
It is sharing content for you right now, Doc. So
Okay,
you
good.
just got to open up whatever your PowerPoint. There we go.
Okay, I'm up and running now. Can you see everything there okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So while Doc gets up and running here, just to give him a little bit of information, for those that don't know, Dr. Rothermich is a board-certified orthopedic surgeon with a fellowship training in sports medicine. Dr. Rothermich attended the College at the University of Notre Dame, and he earned his medical degree from the University of Virginia. He completed his residency in orthopedic surgery in St. Louis, Missouri at Washington University in St. Louis. He also completed fellowship training in sports medicine at the American Sport Institute and Andrews Sports Medicine in Birmingham, Alabama, where he now practices. Prior to joining Andrews Sports Medicine in Birmingham, he was an orthopedic surgeon. Dr. Rothermich was affiliated with South Florida Orthopedics and Sports Medicine in Jupiter, Florida. In that role, he proudly served as the local consultant for the New York Mets, as well as the team physician for various local organizations and high schools. He currently resides in Vestivia Hills, Alabama, outside of Birmingham, with his wife and 2 children. And on that, Doc, talk to us about some UCL.
Thank you, Jason. Well, I appreciate it. Great talk, first of all, by Eric and the boys there. It's kind of fun to be tag teaming with Eric. Yeah, as Jason mentioned, I practiced for a couple years in Jupiter, Florida, in Eric's backyard there. So he actually took care of a couple of my patients when I was down there. I did some UCLs on, so pretty fun to be teamed up with him. So I'm just going to go through some of the data on our project that we've been working on over the past few years, looking at the incidence of UCL surgery in collegiate baseball players. So I think most of you probably in this room have been a part of this study or have known about it in some way. It was kind of fun for me to go through the list of participants and see a lot of familiar names on there, a lot of people that I've known over the last few years that helped us out with this study. With this many of the athletic trainers listening today and being a part of this, being able to finally discuss this study, I wanted to issue a blanket apology to everybody for pestering with all the emails and calls over the last few years. This is a study we've had a lot of fun with. We've gotten a lot of good data. I wanted to go through that today and give you guys an opportunity to ask some questions about some of the things that we looked at. I feel like I've, with most of you that I've seen kind of on the participant list here, interacted with most of you over the last few years. A lot of you have kind of asked questions as we've gone about some of the dynamics of the questions we asked and some of the data that we found. So just wanted to give everybody an opportunity today to go through that and to go through some of the questions. Let's see here. It's not letting me. There we go. Okay. So let me know if this is not working okay, Jason, but I just wanted to go through. I know most of you have seen my name from the emails, and I've talked to a lot of you on the phone. Jason already went through kind of my background. So Midwest guy, grew up in St. Louis, went to the University of Notre Dame, University of Virginia for medical school, returned back to St. Louis for my orthopedic residency at WashU, and then had an opportunity to do the Orthopedic Sports Medicine Fellowship down here at St. Vincent's Hospital at the American Sports Medicine Institute and Andrews Sports Medicine. Knew pretty much right away at the end of fellowship that this is where my family and I wanted to live. This is definitely where I wanted to do my orthopedic practice with some of the big boys here at Andrews Sports Medicine. We had to wait for a couple years for a couple people to move around and some people to retire and things. So had the opportunity to spend 2 years down in Jupiter, Florida. Not a bad place to spend a couple years with South Florida Orthopedics, just up the road in Port St. Lucie. With that group, as Jason mentioned, was able to be involved with the Mets organization there. Their spring training complex and rehab facility is in Port St. Lucie, about a mile from where our practice was located, one of our satellite facilities. So really fun for me to get to work with the Mets. I was the team consultant for the Mets down there and the primary team doc for the minor league team and for the spring training guys and the guys that rehab down there. So a fun couple years working with the Mets. And now I'm back home. Now I'm back in Birmingham at Andrews Sports Medicine. I've had the opportunity and the privilege to get to train under and now work with the big dog himself, Dr. Andrews. So it's been a real blessing for me to be able to be part of that legacy and to work with him here. This is my crew, as Jason mentioned, wife and 2 kids. Very happy to be. We spent 2 years on the beach and now we're back in the hills. So we're living in Birmingham now and just enjoy being here in the South. So just to go through, I know a lot of you are probably familiar with this study, but just as a basic introduction to going through some of the data, the reason we started this study and the main thing we wanted to look at in doing this study, this was the brainchild of Stan Conti, who I think is with us today. We heard from him last week out on the West Coast, and then Jeff Dugas, one of my partners here at Andrews, started this discussion right as I was entering my sports medicine fellowship year here, that there had been really a well-documented increase in UCL surgeries in professional baseball players, so major and minor league baseball players. A lot of that is due to Stan's work, Lentych here at ASMI, and some other experts in baseball science research have clearly demonstrated that increase at the professional level. But surprisingly, the prevalence data at younger ages was very, there was very little literature on high school collegiate UCL surgeries. We knew that these injuries were happening in younger patients. We've seen revision rates have increased in the majors and in the minor leagues. So we know that index procedure, the primary UCL reconstruction or repair, is happening at a younger age in these patients. But surprisingly, there was just nothing available at the collegiate level. Very few studies that investigated specifically this epidemiology. And so, as you all know, in this group, the athletic training staff really is the front lines for taking care of the athletes that know the individuals. They're the critical care component, and they're really the best source of knowledge. So we tried to figure out how to design a way to capture all the data we could in terms of injury rates at the collegiate level. That's when the idea was born that we really need to use the athletic trainers because they're the ones that are right there on the front lines. This is John Michelini from Florida. I had the opportunity as a fellow to cover the SEC baseball tournament in Hoover, and this is a game that I covered. As a fellow, you go there and you think, oh, it'd be fun to see, a couple of four baseball games in a row, something like that. And this was an 11 a.m. start. Florida was playing, and I got there. I got my free hot dog, and I sat down behind home plate as the covering team physician as a fellow. And I think it was the first batter of the game took a fastball off the ear hole and got a fracture of his skull, actually. And then a little later in the game, this guy, the center fielder, took a weird fly ball bounce off the lip. And John's the one who's right there. So he knows what's going on. And so we knew we had to use the athletic trainers for this study because they would know most accurately the local injury data for their own teams. So that direct connection between us, the research team. So I'm part of the group at ASMI here in Birmingham, and then all these individual athletes out there. So we dreamt up this study of looking at injury rates in collegiate baseball players, and there needed to be something to bridge that gap between us and them. And the obvious answer was the athletic training staff. Importantly also, and I've talked with a lot of you about this over the years, it adds that layer of anonymity. It protects the patient's protected health information, HIPAA, all those things that we worry about. to be able to get a lot of information without knowing players' names or statistics or personal data was really important. And I think that was a really key element for us in being able to build a successful study that got everybody involved and interested. And so what we did, and most of you know this, I think a lot of people probably know what that screen grab is from the upper right. You've seen it every May for the last few years. So we designed this de-identified electronic survey that was filled out by you guys, by the athletic trainers at the baseball programs at all these participating schools. And it gathered a ton of information. So for those who are here who did not do this survey or weren't a part of this, at the end of every season, you would get an email from me and you'd fill out this survey. And so we tried to trim it up each year to make it a little quicker, a little shorter, a little more lean, that we gathered only the essential data that we were interested in looking at. One of the athletic trainers, I don't know if they're here today, but they took to calling me the Grim Reaper of the college baseball season, because usually the day after your team got eliminated, you get an email from me. And so sorry about that, but it was a good way to kind of capture all the information from everybody before everybody packed up for the summer. So when Stan and Jeff Dugas and I kind of started talking about this, we had initially talked about 3 conferences, just doing basically a pilot study, looking at a couple different conferences. And we tried to build it smartly with the conferences that we knew, where we knew people. So the SEC, obviously, from being here in Birmingham, we knew almost all the athletic trainers at that point 3-4 years ago in the SEC conference. I saw Brandon Platt on the call today. He was the athletic trainer at Troy, who I think was officially the first one to sign up for the study. So we knew through Troy and taking care of that university, most of the athletic trainers for the Sun Belt Conference. And then with Chris Ahmad up at Columbia, we had contacts with most of the athletic trainers in the Ivy League. And so that's where this started. We basically thought we would pull a couple of conferences, maybe get 30 or so schools. And so the idea was kind of formulating. We were trying to figure out how we'd be able to do this. And I saw Scott Stansberry on the call. He's from my alma mater at Notre Dame. I think he was the first one. He emailed me and said, I heard about this. We want to be involved. Let's get the ACC in. And that was, I don't know if Scott knew this, but that was kind of one of the turning points of this, where it was starting to catch on and people understood that this was a pretty easy way to get a lot of information. And so then it just went from there. And so over the next year, we decided to invite everybody. And so we sent out invitations to every Division I baseball program. It ended up being 299 schools over the 3 years of this study. This was going to be the 4th year, unfortunately, with COVID and with everything that's gone on. It's changed the world as we know it, obviously, and certainly changed the course of this study. Most of you know we were in the middle of kind of getting everybody on board for the 4th year, and this has basically abruptly ended the data collection. But through the first 3 years, what we had done, the first year we did half of Division I. The second and third years we invited all of Division I. There were 3 schools who regrettably were not able to participate due to specific restrictions at their institutions. One was a military institution, but all 3 had their own kind of separate research entities, and so they were very nice about it, but they just weren't able to participate. And this is just amazing. I mean, I think most of you here know that the success of this study was the participation of all the athletic trainers, and we just could not believe that all 3 years we got every single person to do it. We got every single school that was involved to fill out this survey, which had, as far as we know, had never been accomplished in any kind of research study at any level. And it was really the key component of the success of this study, was that this was as accurate information as we could think to gather, where each local athletic trainer was filling out the data on their school, where clearly they would know their 35 or so players and their data. And so with 100% participation for 3 years, we were just astounded at how successful this was, thanks to you guys. And that was really the linchpin in pulling together a successful study with some valuable information. What was amazing to us, so the only other study that was out there at this point when we got started and started talking about it, there was one study that looked at, I believe it was the Big Ten and the SEC over the course of several seasons. There were some computer extrapolations and some projections in terms of how many surgeries per year per team could be expected And from those extrapolations, the number that was generated from that would be somewhere around 30 or 40 UCL surgeries in all of Division I in a given year. So in 12 months, where we said from the end of one season to the end of the next season, the previous literature that was out there, which was pretty sparse, estimated somewhere between 30, 40 surgeries. We were talking about it. We thought that can't be right. That has to be low. That seems ridiculously low. Just from the surgeries that come through ASMI, that come through here, we thought that can't be right. And so you can imagine our surprise the first couple years of this when we realized it was very low, that these were the actual numbers. And these were the numbers that we generated from our study. So over the last 2 years, when we had basically all of Division I, 99% of Division I involved, 230 and 223 surgeries over the last 2 years. So the surgical rate, which initially was projected to be about 0.2, 0.3 surgeries per program per year, is actually much higher when we get much more accurate information on a wide scale. And so by being able to break down those numbers, we looked at by year how this works and how many surgeries are happening per program per year. This is the first year. Now, again, this was half of Division I, so 155 schools participated in this year. And this is the raw number of surgeries per program. So looking at 67 programs had no surgeries. And then, for example, this first year, we had one school that actually had 5 surgeries over the 12-month period. And then we continued that for the next 2 years. And we saw the numbers were about the same in terms of trends. Just a couple of what we call really high surgical teams where you get up to 4 surgeries. There were 2 teams last year that had 4 surgeries and a smattering throughout that had multiples. So overall, about 20% of schools had multiple surgeries, more than 2. Very high number indeed. And then looking at the percentage of programs per number of surgeries, about half every year. About half of the programs had at least 1 surgery. And then of those, again, about 20% had 2 or more. So this was pretty stable data that we found, and certainly interesting to trend this over the course of 3 years. Again, we wish we could have done 5, but we found that this 3-year data was compelling. It was not that surprising to us looking at the average, the positions of the players. We expected it to be obviously predominantly pitchers. Interesting to us that in terms of the other numbers, and this is just going through year by year, certainly a vast majority were pitchers, about 83 to 85% each year. Catchers were pretty consistently ranked second, and then a smattering of infielders and outfielders each year. So not very surprising data, but it's interesting to us, and we think valuable to be able to put a number on it, to be able to say about 83 to 85% were pitchers. Of those, a majority each year were relievers, so that the flamethrowers that came in that presumably had a higher torque on the elbow as they came in, and they were typically the fast-throwing relievers. Not significantly different, but a majority each year. And then going through academic level, we expected that the young players would get this more often, and then we were able to prove that statistically each year that the majority were underclassmen versus upperclassmen. That's not surprising. What's interesting is we captured a lot of freshmen. What we don't know still is at the high school level what this looks like. And clearly a lot of kids are coming in having surgery in their freshman year. This is a lot of times this is a redshirt freshman year. So it confirms what we had known, is that players are getting this at a young age. The average age of our study over the 3 years was 19.9 years old to get this surgery. What we don't know is the other end of the bell curve. So we're talking a lot with COVID right now about bell curves and flattening the curve. So what we found through this study is we're looking at kind of the right side of the curve. This is the back side of the curve. And so the question is, what's happening at the high school level? We still don't know. But this gives us a lot of information that was unknown 3-4 years ago in terms of numbers at the collegiate level. Again, percentage of surgery over the 3 years per academic level, majority freshmen, certainly a majority underclassmen each year. Very interesting to us. And then we looked at the time per year. So the way we broke this down was over the 12 months, we wanted it to be broken into pretty clean and even quarters of the year or seasons of the year. And the way we termed these, and we put dates on there when everybody was filling out the survey, but we called it the previous postseason. So just pretending that everybody was taking the study this year, the previous postseason would have been last summer. It would have been from the time your team finished last season until the end of the summer. The off season we considered roughly the fall. I think it was September, October, November. The preseason was basically the winter, December, January, and the first half of February. And then the in-season months were from basically the opening day, so Valentine's Day or so, until your team finished. So for the teams that finished around Memorial Day, just prior to the conference tournament or during the conference tournament, they would have obviously a shorter season than those that go to Omaha. So that was a different length per year, but we wanted to capture all the surgeries that happened in season for whatever team that athlete was playing for. Not surprising that most of the surgeries happened during the in-season months. And then each year, usually there was a little spike in the previous postseason, which shows us most players right at the end of the season are trying to get surgery to rehab in time to get back for the next year. So again, interesting data that was unknown, not terribly surprising there, and not statistically significant except for the fact that the majority were in-season months. And some of you have seen these maps, so I sent a lot of this data out to the athletic trainers of each school at the end of each year. So I wanted you, that was essentially just a thank you to participating in this study. I wanted everybody to have the data. This was not a secretive thing. This was the goal, and Stan and I and Dugas and everybody else had talked about this a lot throughout the length of this study. So for the past 3-4 years, we said this study is for knowledge. We want everybody to know this. And so you guys are encouraged, and I'd be happy to send this out, share with your athletes, with the coaches, families. We want this information to be out there. We want people to know, and that's why we did this study. There were some questions that came up over these maps over the years. People wondered what they were exactly. So these are essentially heat maps. We were looking at climate to see if climate played a role at all. And so the red states are the warm weather states. And the way we defined that was by the NOAA average temperature of 55 degrees or higher. That's how Delaware became a warm weather state. And New Mexico became a cold weather state, I guess, because of the altitude in New Mexico. The average temperature is below 55 degrees. And these are where the players went to high school. And so the reason we did this is since we knew a majority of the players coming in were going to get their surgery as underclassmen, and we certainly knew that after the first year, we knew that most of the mileage went on the elbow in high school. And so that was our best way of being able to understand. We knew that the South would definitely predominate if we looked at where everybody was playing at college. We wanted to know where they came from, where they originated from geographically. And so I know one year an athletic trainer emailed me and said, well, I'm from, I think, Oregon, for example, and there's 0 for Oregon. Well, I think that player probably came from Washington, and they just happened to play collegiately in Oregon. But this is the high school origin. So interesting to us to see each year how everything progressed. This is the second year, and then this was last year. Again, these were where all the players played high school ball. And so looking at it, we see over the 3 years, and again, the last 2 years we think were the most accurate because it's all of Division I. The first year was probably a Southern predominance for the half of Division I that we used, just because it's the schools that we knew the athletic trainers. So coming from Alabama, I think we picked conferences that first year that were primarily based in the South. And so we think that's why the number was a little higher that first year. But for the last 2 years, basically identical, and both show a majority of players come from warm weather states, but certainly not significant. It's barely a majority at all. So we think, that really definitively proves what I think the literature is bearing out, and what we've been talking about over the past few years here is that climate no longer really plays a role in surgical risk for UCL surgery for collegiate baseball players. So this is one of the most interesting things that we looked at, and it was reconstruction versus repair. Again, this was something that was completely unknown 3-4 years ago. Jeff Dugas here at Andrews and at ASMI was really critical in developing the UCL repair with the internal brace technique. And so he liked this slide. He was very interested in knowing the numbers at the collegiate level. It was interesting to us, and obviously the athletic trainers know whether their players had a reconstruction or a repair, just in terms of the rehab timelines and the differences there. So this was an easy thing to find out. And it was pretty definitive that each year the percentage of UCL repairs had increased. And it's a real tragedy that this has ended the way it has after 3 years, because we'd really love to see where this continues to go over the next few years. But we certainly think that our first 3 years, the data was very interesting. In terms of future directions, a lot of it's unknown right now. Our goal was to run this out for 5 years, to think that we would really get good data in terms of trends and knowing where things are at. Stan's obviously done a lot of work with Major League Baseball and minor league baseball. We had talked about looking at junior colleges. Stan and I had talked about doing this in some of the western states or potentially Southwest and some of the junior colleges. We've talked about high school level. The Caribbean is an area that we haven't talked about really at all in terms of looking at this. So there's a lot of different opportunities and a lot of kind of dark corners where we don't know some of the data still. And so we feel like at the end of 3 years, we're really happy with the data that was produced from this study, but there's certainly a long way to go in terms of understanding the current trends of where it's at and how that can ultimately lead to prevention of these injuries. But this is the team that put this all together over the past few years. We were instrumental in kind of coming up with the survey and the questions, but it just would not have happened without the athletic trainers at each institution filling out the survey and actually completing it accurately to give us that data. And so we can't be more grateful for your work over the past 3 years, really 4 years, and are so happy with kind of the way things worked out with the study. And again, share this with as many people as you think would be interested, because that was our main goal with it. And we're very, very pleased that that we were able to get it done and happy to talk about it today. So I know we're a little over, but happy to go through any questions or any comments from anybody here.
Doc, just want to say, obviously, thanks a hell of a lot for taking the time to do this. It's a nice appreciative, ahead of the publication presentation there on that information. I don't really think that I speak alone when I say this, but where can we go from here to help you more? I mean, with that amount of people being, jumping forward to giving you information, what are some things that we could do in the future? How can we expand upon this study, or is that even something you guys have thought about at this point?
Well, that's where the discussion's starting to head now. We thought we had a couple more years before we kind of knew where to go next. I think the key thing for this to kind of wrap up this study is to just promote it and to talk as much as we can about it so people know what the trends look like. We've talked a little bit about whether we loop back around in a few years and do it one more year just to see what things look like in terms of the trend a few years from now. It's hard to know when it would happen. There's a lot of unknowns with the virus right now in terms of when we're going to be playing again. We think, and the reason we suspended the study now is we think, obviously this year's data would be essentially worthless with the season getting cut so short. And we don't even know that next year's data would be very accurate because it just changes the capture period is so different now that it would really taint the data, I think. So I think, that's the next step is to figure out essentially how do we use this data and apply it. I gave this talk to the front office of the New York Mets last summer. They were interested. They heard about it. They were interested in getting some of this information. The professional level had just started to hear that we were doing this. Obviously, they're interested from a draft perspective and prospects and the minor league system as well. So it was very well received at the major league level. I think they'd be interested at a more broad level in learning this information that we've gotten. So I think that's probably where we'll go in the immediate future is just again spreading the conclusions of this study around as much as we can, and learning how to retool and hopefully come back and loop around and eventually get more data down the road that we can compare with these last 3 years.
This is Stan Conti. I don't know can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple comments. One, that we are going to start thinking about restarting this in a different way. One of the issues that we're facing now with the shutdown of baseball at the high school and collegiate level, what is going to happen in regards to UCLs in 2021 if we start back in a regular season? Will that decrease the number of UCLs since there's not as much throwing, there's not as much travel ball, and there's not the overuse that we've seen that may be contributing to UCL surgeries? Will it be an increase or a decrease in regards to this? The other thing that we wanted to do with this study, but we we felt it was going to be an overburden to the ATCs, is talking about prevalence. Difference between incidence and prevalence. Prevalence is have you had a history of UCL surgeries. So that's different than having that surgery that year. And we've done this at the major league level in 2 different studies with prevalence. We showed that 1 out of 4 major league players had a history of Tommy John surgeries. And as you all know, when you get in there, you've got 3 or 4 people who had UCL surgery in high school or junior college, and now they're at your facility. I think the prevalence would be an important part to follow up on as well. We almost added that a couple times the last couple of years, but we just decided that the questions were getting too long, and we were pressing our luck with your time. But I think that's another thing. The other thing is we know, and you know better than we do, the high school and junior colleges, a junior college in Division II, we don't even have a hint of what's going on there, but we got to believe that it's having the same problem. So I think there's still offshoots of this study. Mark and I haven't had a chance to sit and talk about the next steps because we're still depressed about no baseball. So we're gonna be doing that. And any ideas in regards to any of the athletic trainers who want to send us ideas on other things that we can do, you guys are such an important resource for us to be able to take some of this information. So just send us any ideas or topics or things you might want to do. We'll be able to organize it. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Well, Jason,
hey, Doc, this is Brent
for having us on. I really appreciate it, man.
Oh, I think Brandon Platt had a question there before you go, Doc.
Real quick, this is I just wanted to ask you. You know, you talked about at the high school level and trying to see what was going on there with not having athletic trainers at every high school. What do you suspect would be necessary in order to collect that data at a rate that would be useful to you? Would it have to go through the orthopedic surgeons themselves, or would it have to rely on the players themselves actually reporting the data to you?
Yeah, or the coaches. It would be really challenging. You know, that's one thing we had talked about, is that the collegiate level was just that perfect sweet spot, we thought, where there was a reliable athletic trainer level where we know we could get that accurate information from everybody. That just doesn't exist at the high school level. I think relying on the players, their families, the orthopedic surgeons in the community, that would be really challenging. So we had talked about just from a mass information standpoint, being able to access the coaches might make the most sense in terms of having a single resource at each school that would have that same information level. Obviously, it'd be challenging to get, and again, it would be all de-identified, but it'd be challenging to get accurate medical information, that we could really rely on, I think, at a high level from coaches as opposed to athletic trainers. There was a trust there when using when using the athletic trainers, that it would be accurate information in terms of the surgical details. So that's something that would probably have to be sacrificed at the high school level. But being able to get the numbers, that might be make the most sense, but certainly challenging compared to the college level.
Thank you.
Hey, Doc, this is Scott Stansbury up in Notre Dame. Good to see you on here. And thanks for your talk. One question I think, and this is just an idea, and kind of to Stan's comment about the prevalence, could we add to the survey that you sent out of, we kind of already have those medical histories of the guys that come in. Mm-hmm. So would it be, prudent in the study to add prevalence as a question of like, okay, how many freshmen that came in this year had a previous history, and that may give you the data that you need. I don't know. Well,
and we have, we have, Stan and I talked about that every year. We talked about kind of our wish list of things we wanted to get. I think number one, as Stan alluded to, number one on the wish list for this study every year was to get that 100%, to get everybody to participate. And so that was kind of that. It was some kind of algorithm to figure out, how many questions are too many. And even though we think that would be very interesting information and certainly valuable, our fear in doing that with each year as we continue to build on this, our fear was that we would lose some of the participation if that was not readily available. Because the beauty of this, I think the best thing about this study was how quick it was. That I think each year, the average length to do the survey of time that was available, we could see that information from SurveyMonkey. The average time to take the survey was like 9 seconds. And so that's an easy way to convince everybody to do it, because it takes 9 seconds on average. And that's a lot of people that just hit no and submit, for that half of the programs that didn't have any. But to be able to get that information, we knew we would be sacrificing the number that we would get back, that it would not be 100%, but it would be interesting. So we thought, even if we got a prevalence on half of the programs, so even if half the programs answer that question, we talked about different ways to do it. Could we have it launch into a separate poll to where everybody fills out the incidence portion, and then there's one more question that's separate, so it doesn't screw up that part of it. That's something that we could certainly do in the future. I think the response, and we talked about this, that each year it actually got easier, that the more athletic trainers got used to taking the survey, and the more people understood that this is a quick thing that gets a lot of information, it was actually the amount of time it took to get every single school to respond got smaller each year, to where last year it took like 4 weeks to have everybody fill it out, which is, again, amazing. So we know that there was interest and enthusiasm there, that it wasn't people just trying to get me to stop calling them and stop emailing, that people are interested in this information. And so I think there would be a large percentage of athletic trainers who would be able to have that information readily at hand and would be able to fill that out. So that'll be part of us kind of going back to the drawing board now and figuring out, is there any more information that we can gather, since we have essentially a group of athletic trainers that we know are invested, interested, enthusiastic, because if we wait a couple years, there's going to be a lot of turnover. Each year, we knew from the 300 or so athletic trainers, each year there were about 100 new. And so that was the challenge each year, was to convince a third of Division I programs who had new athletic trainers or new graduate assistants who were taking care of the baseball team and would be filling out the survey, to kind of get them caught up to speed. And so that's the tough part now of waiting out this next 2 years, is that's going to turn over to where we may have half of our registry where I've got an Excel that's got, I'm sorry to say, all of your information on it, all of your cell phone numbers, your emails, all that stuff. That's not going to be very accurate in a couple years. And so that's part of us trying to figure out logistically when and if and when we'd be able to get more information, and whether we go the prevalence route from there.
Thanks.
Hey, just real quick, I just wanted to make sure everybody knew, for transparency, that Marc and I wanted to put prevalence on. It was Glenn Fleisig that kept knocking us down. And
let the record show.
I want to make sure on record, Marc and I really wanted to do that, but Glenn just dug in, so he was probably right.
Right.
Well, if nobody has anything else, Doc, we really appreciate it, and we'll let you get off to seeing some patients for the rest of the day.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
For everybody else, thanks for participating and being a part of this. Next week, as I indicated in our email, we're going to shift to Tuesday, which was the second most popular day, due to the Wednesday CEU event at the Stedman Clinic. If anybody has an issue with that, feel free to send me an email. But that's what we're going to do. Our main presenter is going to be Mike Reinhold, who's going to talk on the science behind weighted ball programs. I do not have a second presenter yet, so if anybody is interested, file away, or I can certainly find some things to fill the time. Other than that, you guys have a great week. Stay well, stay healthy, and if anybody needs anything, you know how to find me.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Jason.